Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our live stream conversation about the new book, Superpower, One Man's Quest to Reinvent American Energy. We're here at the American Wind Energy Association this afternoon. My name is Evan Vaughn, Media Relations Manager here at the association. I'm joined by Russell Gold and Michael Skelly. Thank you both for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Russell is the author of Superpower, a new book out in the last month that focuses on the transition of wind power from a boutique energy source to a mainstream contributor to American energy production. And he tells that story as well as some of the challenges that growing wind is facing related to infrastructure and transmission lines through the eyes and the life of Michael Skelly, the former chairman and co-founder of Cleanline Energy Partners and a long-distance transmission developer company. Michael is now with Lazard as a senior advisor. It's an investment firm. And I'd just like to thank you again both for being here. And I have to say, I finished up the book last week. Really enjoyed it, even as somebody in the energy industry for a couple of years here. I learned a lot from it, a lot of the history before I joined. And you know, Russell, you embarked upon this. You interviewed over 150 people. Why did you decide to tell this story, and what was the most interesting thing that came out of it for you in all those interviews?
Well, I wanted to tell this story because I think I sort of realized that there were a lot of people talking about renewables, a lot of people talking about climate change, but there was very little that was actually being done about it. And I wanted to tell the story of not just, climate's changing, but what are people who are out there in the world doing about it? And doing about it on a big scale. You can put solar panels on the roof, that's great, but what are the projects that are out there that are trying to move the needle in a really profound way? And so I profiled and wrote about Skelly here and what he was doing. What I think was most fascinating to me in working on this story is that I wouldn't have pursued this book. I mean, this book it's a narrative, it's intended for a non-energy audience, but I wouldn't have pursued it if it wasn't rooted in some reality. And I was really blown away when I encountered a couple of very large-scale federal research projects that looked at what would happen if we built up the transmission grid and used more renewables. And the conclusion they came to, which still I have trouble wrapping my brain around, is that you can't get to 100%, but you can get to 50, 60, 70% renewables, substantially lowering carbon dioxide. And here's the catch, without significantly raising the price of electricity. And when I found out that that had work that was been done, not from the industry, but from federal scientists, I thought to myself, okay, this is a story worth telling because it's a goal worth pursuing.
Absolutely. I tell that story of low-cost wind and the innovation every day, and I think there's an endless amount of discussion that can be had around that. And I think that Michael, you saw that as you were starting up Cleanline Energy Partners. You saw the opportunity that wind offered consumers, that wind offered the grid. So tell the folks out there a little bit about your business model, why you decided to start Cleanline, and what the value of these long-distance, high-voltage transmission lines are.
Yeah, so I've been working on building renewable projects for about 25 years now, and originally in Latin America, and then as part of a company called Renewable, which became Horizon Wind, which is now EEP. And even back then, 10 years, today it's utterly obvious that we need to do more on the grid side of things, but 10 years ago you could sort of tell that this issue was coming up. And we had been reasonably successful in building wind farms around the country, and we said, okay, what can we do that's going to really move the needle or make a difference? And transmission, when you think about it, the challenge in those terms, transmission just is answers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so a lot of people, Russell sort of alluded to this, a lot of people have been talking about transmission, talking about the grid, what do we need to do to the grid, and there were countless conferences about this topic, and we said, the way we figure things out in the United States is people go try to do stuff, and that's how we test it. And that's what happened with offshore wind, by the way. Some people try to do it, some were successful, some were not, but in that process we learned how things get done, and now they're getting done in the US. So we thought, if we can sort of crack the code on this, or at least begin to unlock the code, then it'll lead to to big transmission lines getting built, and with the big transmission lines, then you can further expand how much renewable energy we build. Because you got, the big challenge here is taking energy from the middle of the country where it's super windy, and you can produce electricity at a very low cost, to load centers east and west where people need the power, want the power, and because it's so energetic in these locations, you can do it in a very cost-effective way.
I think it's interesting, one of the chapters Russell writes about the Pacific Intertie, which is basically the only long-distance, high-voltage, direct current transmission line in the country. And it inspired a little bit of the work that you did, Michael, and I was really struck by how there's a lot of similarities between that and the moon landing, that we sought to beat our communist adversaries in this technological race. The Russians were building long-distance transmission lines. Kennedy gave a speech, a very inspiring speech about transmission, believe it or not. And then we built that line. It was successful in connecting hydro in the Northwest to Southern California. And then we never built another long-distance direct current transmission line until Michael tried to do it. And so I wonder, what's changed? Why can't we replicate that success with the Pacific Intertie?
Well, so there are a couple of fascinating things about the Pacific Intertie. First of all, it's been operating pretty much nonstop for, 40, 50, almost 50 years now. So by all accounts, it's been a huge success. It survived. It went down for a little while because there was an earthquake pretty much directly under where it comes down to earth in the Los Angeles area. But other than that, it's been remarkably reliable. It provides a lot.
Did you just say the transmission line came down to earth? You're running with the space metaphor, aren't you?
I guess so, yes. Where it comes down to the converter station and then joins the grid, yes. But you alluded to it, the Soviet Union was starting to build or talk about building these lines. And this was right after Sputnik. And Kennedy basically said, we've got beat once. We're not going to get beat on this new technology. And so he brought together governors, heads of utilities, and said, we're going to make this work. And that's, I think, what we're missing right now, because there's been a lack of federal leadership on these type of projects. We seem to be very content with this very balkanized grid, where the grid in the southeast and the grid in the northeast and the Midwest don't really connect and relate to each other. They connect, but it's really difficult to move a lot of power from one to the other. But yet we're in a position right now where we're tapping into this new resource in the middle of the country, inexpensive wind. And wind is the low-cost source of electricity right now. So it would be fascinating if there was a discussion which said, look, how do we use this? Much like when we figured out how to do fracking, we found all this inexpensive natural gas. There was a discussion, how do we deploy this natural gas? Well, we can have the same question right now. And the answer is, or I would argue one of the best answers is long distance transmission. It's just a matter of having this conversation and having some federal leadership, frankly.
It all starts with small conversations like this one. So I, again, appreciate you guys being here. I just want to interrupt for a moment to say, if anybody's just joining us now, this is a live conversation with Russell Gold, Wall Street Journal investigative reporter and author of the new book, Superpower, out last month, and Michael Skelly, former chairman of Clean Line Energy Partners, a long-distance transmission company. Something, Russell, that you just mentioned that really strikes me as an important aspect of our balkanized transmission grid. So we have a dozen or more different electricity grids operating in this country, and it's as if we never completed the national interstate system, as if we didn't connect our highways from east to west. And to a certain extent, that's exactly what you were trying to do, Michael. You were building an expressway for clean energy from the middle of the country to areas where it's needed. And I wonder, as you were doing that work, I understand there was a lot of community work that you had to do. You had to work through where that line would be sited. Could you talk a little bit about your experiences with those communities and talking to folks about this?
Well, I mean, that's the job of any project developer. If you're doing a transmission line, if you're doing a pipeline, if you're doing a wind farm, solar facility, et cetera. And we spent a lot of time and energy on this effort, and unfortunately, the tough thing about transmission is we don't really have, as Russell alluded to, we haven't sort of found the national leadership around this topic, and this is infrastructure that's above ground and that some people don't want to look at because it does have visual impact. So we worked as hard as we could around that issue, but despite that, we ran into a lot of opposition. All of it, I'm sure, heartfelt. Some of it, maybe not all of it heartfelt. Some of it just politically motivated. That in a some politicians in Arkansas realized that this was good politics to oppose an interstate transmission line that used renewable energy, and so Senators Cotton and Lamar Alexander just went after us really, really hard. We actually had a vote on the floor of the Senate at one point where they tried to kill the project. So that opposition, and by the way, for any project of any scale, you're going to have opposition. What you need then is leadership. You got to do your job, and then hopefully you'll find political leaders who will, believe in the project and how you're trying to do it, and they'll support it, and that's how you sort of get through it. We did not find enough support to overcome the opposition.
It does seem that my reading of the book, politics really was the core of a lot of the problems that prevented the Clean Line projects from crossing the finish line. And you noted some opposition there, and Russell, you covered this in the book, but we also have a lot of support on both sides of the aisle for wind, and I think increasingly for transmission. Do you perceive, to either of you, do you see these politics changing around transmission, or is it just a matter of getting the message out there about the benefits?
Well, I think there's a lot of support for wind politically, for the development of wind farms. Renewable portfolio standards have been incredibly popular, and with one exception, maybe early this week or last week, have managed to stick around and grow. There's been a lot smaller conversation about transmission. I give Skelly a lot of credit for really bringing up and starting a conversation about transmission. And so maybe, I've heard you say this many times, maybe you were just a little too ahead of the game, a few years too early, because I don't think that conversation about transmission has really happened. One of the chapters in the book is entitled E Pluribus Unum, the motto of the United States, from many one. And it referred to an idea almost 100 years ago, almost 100 years old, to take all of these disparate grids and try to bring together and create a United States grid, a continent-wide grid. That's a challenge for the 21st century, to build a new grid. The grid that we have right now is a marvel. It's often said as one of the great inventions of the 20th century. We flip on a light switch and we have lights. But it was built and it was a 20th century. We're in the 21st century, and we have new priorities now. And those priorities are cleaner sources of energy and affordable energy. And I think one of the things I learned in reporting this book was that the way to get there is transmission. And so it's time for that conversation to begin.
And I think credit goes to both of you for driving that conversation forward. Certainly, writing a book like Superpower is an incredible way to draw attention to this important story. And I think that you've done a really fantastic job of also reporting in your day-to-day beat at the Wall Street Journal. And I think that there's more room to get this story out there into the press. And I think I reflect often on what the conversation is around climate change and how we address increasingly growing clean energy. And as you noted, we're at about 10% wind on the grid today in the United States, about 20% renewables in general. So we've got a long way to go, and transmission is really that medium-term tool that will get us from where we are to a cleaner grid.
Well, it's an important conversation to have. We're at 20% right now. Do we want to get to 50%? Do we want to get to 80%? Are we happy where we are with 20% right now? I would find it fascinating to have that conversation. I don't think we are having that conversation right now. sort of letting the market drive the conversation, and that's often the way we do things right now. But if we just, without policy, if we just sort of let the market develop the way it is, we're going to hit a ceiling fairly soon. Because what's the point of building a wind farm, another wind farm out in the middle of the country, if you can't move those electrons anywhere? And if you have to sit idle more than you want, and you can't deliver the electrons that you promised your investors or that you promised your customers. So we're quickly getting to that point.
Great. And I'll remind our audience that we are taking questions, so if you have any questions for Russell or Michael, please enter them into your Facebook prompt, and in just a moment here we'll go over and address a few of those questions before we wrap up. You know, one thing I think that struck me about the transition of wind energy through the story and Superpower and Michael through your business process was that the technology was increasingly getting cheaper as time went on, even from the first conversation you had with some potential clients to sort of the final conversations that you had. And I think that an important piece of the puzzle here is that transmission investments can be done by private companies like CleanLine, and they can be done in a cost-effective way that actually ultimately saves consumers money. And so, Michael, I'm wondering how you approached that case when you were talking to a potential buyer to sell your product, what you were going to deliver through CleanLine.
Yeah, so I mean the pitch is similar to what one would say if you're selling solar energy or wind energy. It's in this case we're selling wind plus transmission. The challenge was a little bit, it comes in such bigger chunks, so there are real economies of scale. You couldn't do a 500 megawatt line from Oklahoma to Memphis. You need to be in the thousands of megawatts. With that comes a chunkiness that makes it a little harder on the sales process, to be totally honest. And that's why as people who are into the policies around transmission are sort of thinking through this challenge, one of the answers is clearly that you need if there's a way to underwrite it to resolve this scale issue, that would be helpful, or a temporary underwriting situation or things like that to sort of push a project like this over the top. But the sales process is similar. Like, this is cheaper than burning coal or gas or whatever, and therefore you should buy it.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't get much simpler than that.
Yeah.
Cheap and clean. So before we go to audience questions, any other thoughts or reflections on Superpower, the process of writing the book, work at CleanLine? Welcome any thoughts there.
I was, it was a lot of fun to write this book. When you're writing a nonfiction book and you're following a story, you kind of have to, you're never quite sure which way it's going to go. So that was a little nerve-wracking. But look, this is an energy story, but it's a business story, it's a climate story, it's sort of all wrapped up into one. It's a very human story, It's like these are people out there trying to convince other people to build this line, and that's where things get really interesting and messy and exciting. And it was a lot of fun to kind of follow along on this project. And the project that I ended up focusing on, Skelly was trying to build the plains at Eastern. The vision of it was for one of probably the biggest renewable energy project we built in the United States since the Hoover Dam. We're just talking massive amounts of renewable energy. So it's very exciting to sort of see how all this comes together.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, any final thoughts before we go to another question?
On sort of the book process itself, it was when Russell came to us with this idea, and when I say us, I mean us, and that was one of the weird things about the book, is it's one man's quest. Like, we were a whole team of people, and we all worked hard, and I was always uncomfortable, and still am a little uncomfortable with that phraseology. But anyhow, a friend of mine, I was trying to figure out if we wanted to do this. A friend of mine, who was the editor of the Houston Chronicle at the time, said, you have to do this. People really want to understand how renewable energy works. Does this make sense? What does it cost? Is this possible? And the way that they will understand that is through narrative. That's how people learn, is through stories. Okay. And so this guy said, hey, you got to participate in this book, because it's a great opportunity to tell this big electricity story, which a lot of people want to know, how is this all going to play out, and what do we need to do to clean up the electricity and the energy mix.
You know, and there are a lot of people who are sort of scared right now about renewable energy, that if you use too much renewable energy, it's going to sort of fundamentally change things, that the lights will go out at certain times. And you know, one of the things I learned in reporting this book is that the grid operators, you know, these sort of these people who you don't hear very much about, who are sitting there balancing our regional grids second by second, they've gotten really quite good at using renewable intermittent resources, because it's not a guessing game. Like, oh, you know, 1 second the wind farms are working, 1 second they're not. We have a pretty good idea when the wind's not going to blow. We have a pretty good idea when the clouds are coming in and solar is going to not be available. It's all, you can plan for it, and you know, if you look at a major grid like Texas, which is now about what, 25% wind. Very.
Well, on certain days it's 60%.
I think it's definitely hit over 50. Has it hit 60? It probably has hit 60 yet. You know, I live in Texas. I haven't had any brownouts. My television works, you know, when I ask it to. I mean, the only thing that really threatens my television is a strong Texas storm knocking out my satellite. So, I mean, that was one of the things that people feel renewable is new and different and somehow scary. And the fact is, really, it's not. It's, you know, we don't really know when we turn on our lights where those electrons are coming from. Are they coming from a wind turbine or a nuclear power plant or a combined cycle gas plant? And we have a luxury of not caring.
Well, we do have one question from the audience here from Teresa Nicholson, and she asks, as you encounter opposition with the development of a project like the plans in Eastern Line, who do you think is the best voice to communicate facts, some of those things you were just talking about, Russell, about the realities of wind generation, grid operations? Who's the best voice to communicate that to folks who may be unsure about this technology coming to their community?
Yeah, so, I mean, we did this in the wind industry and in transmission, but you need a combination of local folks and technical folks, because some of the issues are technical. And so we always, you know, for a while playing with Eastern, we had 2 rodeo champions on the outreach team, and those 2 women were fantastic, and they could...
Literal rodeo champions?
Yeah.
This is not a metaphor of some sort?
No, these were literal, like, barrel racing and so on. So they could, you know, talk to folks in Oklahoma Panhandle, and they were known to people there, and obviously they would learn a lot from us so that they could go out and explain it, but having folks that people knew and grown up in the community was super helpful. And then we also have subject matter expertise around, you know, various, you know, habitat or site, you know, what do these things actually look like, how wide is the right of way, can you do a visual simulation, things like that. So it's a combination of technical and local resources. I think is the best when you're in a situation like this.
I just was reading a peer-reviewed academic paper where they asked whether people would support transmission if they knew it was from renewable versus coal, versus, I think, nuclear was the third. It was interesting that people were, it was sort of on a scale of 1 to 5, and if you just said, are you in favor of transmission, they were about a 3. It was about neutral, but they got more and more in favor when you told them it was for renewables. And I thought one of that, I was reflecting on that, because one of the interesting things you faced was that sometimes the opposition would sort of raise this specter that if you built this transmission line, it wasn't going to be for wind, it was going to be for coal, because there's so much coal that's being burned in the Oklahoma Panhandle. It didn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, we'd run into that sometimes too, and then sometimes, like, you know, there was an oil and gas company in Arkansas, Southwestern, and they fought us tooth and nail, and I think some of that opposition was based on their.
Were they concerned that their main product, because Southwestern is mostly a gas producer,
well,
were they concerned that they wouldn't be able to sell the gas if
they
too much?
Articulated the concern as one around, you know, it's going to interfere with our operations, but we couldn't understand how they would actually say that, given how directional drilling works and all that. So I think it was sort of just somebody got in their head that this is bad for oil and gas, so they didn't want to do it. That was rare. As you know, the oil majors are not really fighting renewables, many of them are participating.
Mhm.
But now and then, some of the smaller independents would rough us up a bit.
Exxon's now actually purchasing wind to power some of their Permian Basin operations there in Texas, so,
Yeah.
you know, when you've got cheap energy, it's not a tough sell like we said
Right.
before.
Yeah.
Right. And then, you know, the big European majors are increasingly getting pressure from their investors. What are you doing? How are you getting involved in renewables? How are you getting involved in more electricity? So, and I've written about that as well, just the way European companies, Total and Shell. I think, was it Shell who, at the big oil conference in Houston, came out and said that they plan to be the biggest electricity producer in the world in a few years? Shell. This is not a company that makes electricity, generates electricity, but they want to get into it.
It's a bold vision. Well, I think we're about at the end of our time here, and I would just leave you both with any final thoughts or reflections on how we get the transmission grid of the future built in this country.
Yeah, well, first of all, support AWEA. Second, buy the book, because we need to tell the story. We need people to understand how renewable energy works, and if people buy books, that will help them. I don't have any economic interest in books, but Russell and Simon & Schuster, who they do. So we want people to understand our industry, and because I think the more people understand about renewables, the more supportive they will actually be. So those are my final
Well,
thoughts.
that's very nice of you, thank you. Look, to me, as an outsider watching this process, it was exciting. You know, there's this, at the heart of this book is this question, which is, you know, can you and the people that you mustered, which, you know, at one point I think you had 100 people working for Cleanline, you know, you sort of built up this team, and you had allies across the area, political, labor, you know, is this sort of fascinating question. Can they get this to the finish line, and what will that mean, and what are the forces standing against it? So I found it to be a really exciting story, and hopefully conveyed some of that in the book.
Well, thank you both again for sharing a little bit of that story here with our audience on Facebook Live. And I'll just close by saying this has been a live conversation with Russell Gold, Wall Street Journal investigative reporter and author of the new book, Superpower. Please go out and check it out. We'll post some information on the Facebook live stream after this is over. And Michael Skelly, founder and former chairman of Cleanline Energy Partners, now a senior advisor with Lazard Investment. And if you are interested in learning more about the wind industry in general beyond the book Superpower, we'll also be putting some information on the live stream about how you can sign up and follow AWEA's advocacy efforts. So thank you again, gentlemen, and everybody have a good afternoon.
Thank you.